Hello Vault Hunters and welcome to another Borderlands 4 video. This one is going to be all about elemental damage and how it affects you and how it affects enemies and which elements you should use against enemies' health, shield, and armor bars. I've got a little infographic that I'm going to share later on in the video, and I'm also going to provide some tips and strategies for using elemental damage in Borderlands 4. Alright, there are 6 elements in Borderlands 4: shock, radiation, fire, corrosive, cryo, and kinetic. Each element has its own unique effect as well as advantages or disadvantages against shield, armor, and flesh. We're going to go over the exact percentages later in the video, but first, let's go over each element and take a look at their unique status effects. So shock damage can cause targets to become electrocuted. Electrocution deals very high damage over a 2-second duration, and when you're electrocuted, you'll see the shock damage effect on the sides of your screen. When the enemy is electrocuted, you'll see a kind of bluish electrocution look to them, and they'll kind of make noise as if they're electrocuted unless they're robots or synths or whatever we're calling these guys. You'll also find some taser underbarrels that will immediately shock the enemy, and it will actually chain to other nearby enemies. Radiation damage can cause targets to become irradiated. Radiated enemies deal aura damage to nearby enemies for about 4 seconds. This is actually half the time than it was in Borderlands 3. It was at like 8 seconds. And so radiation isn't as good as where it was in Borderlands 3, but it's still really good because when they die, they explode, which irradiates all enemies damaged by the explosion. And then when your character is irradiated, you're going to see like yellowish bubbles, kind of like a little fog at the bottom of your screen. When the enemy is irradiated, they kind of get this yellow tint to them, and you'll see them affect other enemies with their aura. Alright, incendiary damage can cause targets to ignite. Ignited enemies take burn damage over a 5-second duration. When you're on fire, you're going to see kind of a flame effect at the bottom of your screen. When the enemies are on fire, you'll see them have kind of an orange glow. They kind of have like, it looks like they're on fire, like you could kind of see the spurts of fire. And they'll make noises like they're on fire if they're rippers or, you know, of the human variety. Corrosive damage can cause targets to melt. Melting deals damage over an 8-second duration. This dot is twice as long as corrosive was in Borderlands 3. So they've kind of swapped radiation and corrosive in terms of the dot length. So if you're going for a dot build, corrosive might be an interesting choice. And whether you're melting or taking corrosive damage, you're going to see a green effect at the top of your screen. And when the enemy is melting, you're going to see a green glow kind of surrounding them with a little bit of like gas effects coming off of them. Cryo damage slows enemies and eventually freezes them. Frozen enemies are unable to move and they take more melee damage. But in Borderlands 3, they took 3 times melee damage, and Borderlands 4 doesn't seem like it's 3 times anymore. It's been toned down quite a bit, and in fact, the enemies really only freeze when they die, and that might be just because I don't have high cryo efficiency weapons. I'm low level. I'm not fighting enemies that are super tanky right now, so maybe that's just how it works out. But I really couldn't find any enemies that would freeze and still be alive so I could test the melee damage. But on the target dummy, it was like 10%. When you're affected by cryo, you're going to see a freezing effect at the top of your screen. It's a little hard to see, but I think you can see it here. When enemies are affected by cryo elemental damage, they'll start to turn white and they kind of slow down their attacks and their movement speed, and then eventually they freeze. Now the last element is kinetic, and this is just your baseline no elemental damage. It's just going to be your white damage numbers. However, in Borderlands 4, it also does bleed if you are spec'd into it with Vex. So Vex has a unique skill here called Bloodletter, and it says gun and skill critical hits have a chance to apply bleed, causing kinetic status effect damage over time for a duration. Bleed is affected by status effect application chance. It's considered a status effect. So you can also apply kinetic status effect damage, aka bleed, on Vex if you are spec'd into Bloodletter. However, you don't have to be doing kinetic damage. It just says gun and skill critical hits. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note. However, bleed itself is the same as kinetic damage in terms of its bonuses and negatives to different health bars, which, spoiler alert, kinetic is just the same across the board. It doesn't matter if they have shield, armor, or flesh, which is actually different from Borderlands 3. In Borderlands 3, kinetic got a negative 20%, I think, to armor, so it did a little bit less to armor, but in Borderlands 4, kinetic does the same for all health bar types. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of times you're going to be applying multiple elements of damage onto the enemy, especially if you're playing Vex, whether that is from your weapon skills, your ordnance. So if you're wondering what elemental damage you're doing to the enemy, you can always look at the damage numbers that pop up on the enemy. Now, sometimes that's hard because you're doing a lot of critical hits and that big critical text is taking over the numbers, but your numbers are going to be colored differently based on what the element is. And this is best illustrated on Vex because you can pop out different clones and have them all be doing different damage. So this is kind of what it looks like here. All right, now for the numbers. So each element has a specific advantage and disadvantage to health, shield, and armor, like we've kind of been discussing. And these bonuses also change depending on your difficulty, on your game difficulty. So currently in the campaign, we have easy, normal, and hard difficulties. And in the game, you can see that hard difficulty says elemental affinities will be more strict. So for purposes of this infographic, I'm going to show you guys hard campaign difficulty numbers. If you want to see easy and normal mode, you can check out the article on elemental damage on Maxroll, but just know that elemental affinities matter in every mode, just to different degrees. So it really doesn't matter what the number is, you just need to know that, shock does more damage to shield, etc. Also, remember that these elemental advantages and disadvantages are also going to affect you as a Vault Hunter, so keep that in mind when you're looking at elements that have advantages to shield, armor, and health bars, because Borderlands 4 has armor shields in this game. So you can have an armor shield or an energy shield. So there may be times where it's more advantageous to run one over the other. So if a boss is doing lots of corrosive damage, you're having difficulty with it, make sure you have an energy shield on. And if he's doing a lot of shock damage, you might want to have an armor shield on, vice versa. So here are the bonuses in hard mode. So as you can see, especially in hard mode, using the correct element is super important, like we discussed. So let's start off with flesh, aka health, aka the red bar. Kinetic, radiation, and cryo are neutral to health, whereas shock and corrosive only do 50% of their full damage, so they're bad against health bars. And incendiary, aka fire, is the best elemental damage against health bars, which I'm sure is pretty obvious to most people, but it does 175% effectiveness, which is huge. Now moving on to shield bars, aka the blue bar, shock damage is going to be the best at 175% effectiveness, and then comes radiation right under it at 150%. Kinetic is neutral as always, and then incendiary, corrosive, and cryo all receive a 50% decrease in damage against shield. So that's huge. 50% is crazy, just cutting your damage in half. And then lastly, we've got armor, aka the yellow bar, the kind of yellowish orange bar, I guess. And corrosive damage is going to be the best for armor. Just think about it like melting away, eating away at that armor. And it does 175% effectiveness. Cryo is just below it at 150. Kinetic is neutral as always. And then radiation, shock, and incendiary all do 50% of their full damage. In Borderlands 4, you'll also find enemies with multiple shield, health, and armor bars, just like you did in previous Borderlands games. So Maliwan license parts are really good for switching elements on the fly. I really like it as Vex because I can pop clones out a lot easier than I can if I had to switch a full weapon every time. And I always like to pair strengths and weaknesses together. So personally, I like to find a Maliwan weapon that has like radiation and cryo, or shock and corrosive, something that's good against shield and something that's good against armor. Or you could do like cryo and fire or something like that, where there's different elements that are beneficial against different health bars. You can also think that way of pairing those kind of elements when you have an action skill that does a certain damage. So Amon is a great example of that because he has a lot of action skills that do fire and cryo. So you're getting something that's good against flesh and good against armor. And then personally for my weapon, I would want either radiation or shock so that I would be ready for shields as well. Similarly with Harlow, she has a lot of bonuses for radiation radiation and cryo. So radiation is pretty good against shield, it's second best to shock, and then cryo is second best to armor. And what I really like about radiation and cryo is that they don't have any negatives to flesh. So whereas if you're using shock, yes, you're doing more damage to shields, but you're doing a lot less damage to flesh. So radiation and cryo kind of bridge that gap. They're kind of like in the middle. So I really love them for that reason, but also they are really good crowd control elements. So they're really good to have for that as well, because cryo freezes and radiation does big explosions. So I've always been a fan of these two elements, but let me know down in the comments what's your favorite element, because I feel like corrosive is kind of everybody's least favorite element, but in Borderlands 4 the dot is doubled now, so it lasts a lot longer. So I'm curious to see what happens if people start using corrosive more over something like radiation that's been where the dot damage, the dot duration has been cut down. Alright guys, that's it for the video. I hope you learned something. If you did, make sure to give the video a like and subscribe if you want more Borderlands 4 content, because I've got a lot more coming your way. We're also live over at twitch.tv/abbyhour doing a subathon right now, and all YouTube subs and members also contribute to it. Whether you're at the stream or not over on Twitch, you're still going to be able to extend time that way, so make sure to sub, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.